everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. I am still coming to you live from the International Jewish Genealogical Conference in Boston. The only reason you really need to know that is because that means I'm on a wireless internet connection. So if the audio cuts in or out, or even if the video cuts in or out, I'm just going to apologize up front. I am recording this locally on my computer, so when we upload it to YouTube, it should be complete. But for those of you who are joining me live, let's all just keep our fingers crossed together that there aren't too many technical difficulties. So today we are going to be talking about putting your ancestors' lives into historical context. We'll talk a little bit about why that's important. I'll share with you some of the what about how you get the information, and then a little bit of the how as far as recording that information goes. As you may have been watching Who Do You Think You Are? We had the third episode this week with Chelsea Handler. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly in some of our Facebook pages and on Twitter and some emails that we receive as we talk about these episodes is they wish people would trace more information in the trees. The reality is that each of these episodes goes really deep, usually into the lives of just one or two ancestors. And it's not that they're not interested in their whole tree, it's that the stories of the ancestors, or one or two of them, that deep, rich story, is, I think for me anyway, one of the reasons I do family history, to learn more about each individual person in a really meaningful way is so much more interesting to me than just a full pedigree chart where all the blanks are filled in. So today we're just going to talk about historical context and how to gather some of that information and why you would want to. So let's dive in with that introduction. Let's start with a discussion about let's see if I can get my PowerPoint working here. There we go. Okay, let's start with a discussion about why we might want to study the historical context of our ancestors' lives. One of the first reasons is because it helps us to understand them better. It also helps us to understand some of the choices that they made. One of the things that I see a lot of times with people new to family history is that they oftentimes judge the choices that their ancestors made through today's lens, through their perspective on the world, with today's social customs, today's laws, today's rules that govern behavior and morality. And the reality is that our ancestors lived in a very different time. And the more we can understand about the time that they lived in, hopefully the more we can understand them and the choices that they made, for good or not. And some of our ancestors made maybe some not so great choices. But again, understanding them, I think understanding the time helps us understand them better. And understanding them better, at least in my experience, helps me to feel more connected to them. It gives meaning to what I'm doing as I research family history. Now, another reason why you might want to study historical context is that it creates a true family history. It's not just a genealogy of names and dates and places. Like I said, we're not just filling in the blanks on a pedigree chart or a family tree. We're actually creating a family history. There are stories. There are stories to be had in your family tree. And those stories, again, they can connect us to our ancestors. They can help us understand them better. But there's a lot of other benefits to those family stories. You may have tried to share family information with your children or your grandchildren or a brother or sister and find that they have very little interest in those name, dates, and places kinds of information. But if you were to share a little story about the life that that person lived, you might find that they're a lot more interested in that. Not only that, I just read an article this week. It was a study that was done that showed that children who are raised on family stories tend to be better adjusted. They tend to be able to handle stress in particular. They tend to be able to handle stress better. And I thought that was really interesting. I was raised on family stories. My grandmother is a wonderful storyteller. My mother is a wonderful storyteller. And they have kept a lot of our family stories alive. And so I absolutely believe that. Another reason, and of course this is not an exhaustive list, to study historical context for your ancestors' lives is because it'll help you gain clues about where you might find additional records to help grow your family tree. If you understand about bounty land warrants and how that was connected to your ancestors' military service, if you understand about the laws of property laws, or if you understand, I apologize if you can hear those sirens, they're a little distracting. If you understand some of those things, then you know that there are additional records to be found that might help give you further clues about your family members. That's particularly important when we start talking about ancestors in the 16 and 1700s, and even in the early 1800s, where the records exist, but they're a different kind of record than what we're traditionally used to using when we first get started in family history. Census records, birth, marriage, and death records, those are pretty rare and pretty recent, all things considered. And so there are other types of records that we need to start to become familiar with as we go further back in our family tree. So that's the why we study historical context. Let me talk to you just a little bit about some of the questions you can ask. And I had to pare this list down, let me tell you. It was really interesting. I could probably do a whole blog post, and maybe I will, about all of the different kinds of questions that you could possibly ask in order to start to understand the historical context of your ancestors. These are the kinds of questions that if you were a reporter and you were going to interview your third great-grandmother, here's kind of the questions that you would have prepared ahead of time so that you could learn more about her life. In order to understand historical context, one of the tools that will benefit you greatly is curiosity. Just be curious. Be curious about their life. Be curious about the place they lived. Be curious about what was going on in the world. So here are some of those questions that I would encourage you to ask. And like I said, I'll put together a blog post so that you can download some of these for yourself. And I'll include the ones that I edited out of the presentation as well. So one of the questions you should probably be asking is, what was going on in the world and in the country where your ancestor lived during their lifetime? What kind of world events? Were there conflicts? Were there natural disasters? What was going on politically? What was, historically significant events? And then not just in the world or in their country, but also in their state or in their county. What kinds of things were happening locally that affected their lives? I keep up on political events in my own life pretty well, but the things that happen in my own community have a far greater effect on my day-to-day life than the things that happen in the world. There's still some benefit to having both perspectives, but make sure you think locally as well as globally. Come to understand or figure out what religion your ancestors identified with, and then learn more about that faith. So I just recently, fairly recently, within the last couple of years, discovered that I have some Quaker ancestry. And I, prior to learning that, had a very peripheral understanding of that faith. I work with a woman who was raised as a Quaker, and she actually is one of the preeminent Quaker researchers for genealogy, and so I knew that much, and had a few conversations with her. But as I started digging into my New Jersey ancestry and discovered that I had Quaker ancestors, all of a sudden that had more meaning for me, and so I started asking her questions. I started doing some research on my own. I wanted to understand more about that faith, more about the basic tenets of their belief, so that I could understand their lives, and again, the way that they made choices. And as certain children and grandchildren in that family chose to follow different faiths, understanding what might have been going on in the world that might have caused them to change faiths. So for example, using my Quaker ancestry as an example, one of the basic tenets of Quaker belief is that they do not engage in conflict. So particularly in war, that's not something that they choose to participate in. And so as the Revolutionary War heated up, what I discovered in my own family tree was that some of the members of that family chose to affiliate with other faiths. And I think it was a way of maintaining faith while still being able to engage in war for another belief that they felt was important, which was liberty or freedom in the case of the Revolutionary War. Now, again, you have to be really careful not to ascribe your own motives to your ancestors, but understanding more about them and more about the religions that they practiced, the politics of the time, what the different political parties were that they could have engaged in, that's important to understanding them. Another type of question that you can ask yourself and look into has to do with their education. Were your ancestors educated? And there's lots of places where you can find clues to this. Of course, the census almost always lists, starting I think in about 1850 or 60, lists if they were even attending school during the year, the children in the household. Oftentimes you'll also find a column on the census for whether or not the person can read or write, which is an indication of education. Anytime you find any kind of a document that might have a signature on it, something as recently as a World War I draft card, look and see if they actually signed it or if they just marked an X on that field. And so that's really important. That's really important that you do that, because you need to know if they were educated, if other people in their same circumstances were educated. Look at the other people listed on the census page. Look at the other people who lived in their community. That becomes important. Not just were they educated, but were they more educated or less educated than the people that they associated with or affiliated with. Again, just to give you a greater understanding of them. I'm going to add a few more. I did pare down my list of questions, but it's still 2 slides worth. Did your ancestor immigrate or migrate? So a lot of times here at the Jewish Conference, one of the things that I run across is a lot of Eastern European immigrants who left Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, Germany, Ukraine, Romania, Belarus. I'm trying to think of all the people I've worked with this week. Lots of immigration out of those countries, starting in the late 1870s, really heavy through the 1880s, 1890s, into the early 1900s. By 1910, 1920, that starts kind of on a downhill slope until we hit 1930, when that immigration slows to a trickle. And so understanding not just that your ancestor immigrated in 1891, but understanding that slope of immigration, that it picked up speed. It kind of hit a peak in about 1900, and then it started on a downhill slope. Understanding where your ancestor fit in that, right? They came at the height of Eastern European immigration, or they came on the downside of Eastern European immigration. What does that mean? What was going on in Eastern Europe at the time that caused them to immigrate in such great numbers? Also, look at the waves of immigration in your family. In the case of the Eastern European Jews, oftentimes what we see is a father or an elder brother immigrating first and alone, or an older sister immigrating with her new husband right after they get married. And they'll come to the United States and they'll get a job, and then one by one they'll send for some of those older children, and then finally that mother will immigrate alone with the baby or the small children in the family. Understanding that. Understanding, looking at a passenger list and recognizing, who else on that ship came from the same town or village that your ancestor came from. Did they, was there a broker who went through that town selling the American dream and encouraging people to immigrate en masse? Was there maybe a rabbi or a priest who immigrated with his entire congregation, right? So don't always just look for your family on the passenger list, but once you find them, look at the entire ship in context to get some understanding of why or how they immigrated. And don't just think about immigration. Your ancestors may have lived here in what would become the United States for a couple of centuries or more. There was still migration. I have a large portion of my family on my mom's side of the family that were in North Carolina and Virginia for a really long time. And then all of a sudden, within just a few generations, they move to Georgia, and then they move to Tennessee, and then they move up to Kentucky, and then they move from Kentucky down to Arkansas. And so understanding that migration path and then looking for reasons why they migrated about that time period. What was going on? Was there a drought that caused their crops to fail one summer, and so the entire community picked up and moved 3 states away? In the case of my Kentucky ancestors, just an example, one of the things that I discovered was that in 1812, I think it was, there was a major earthquake that affected parts of Kentucky. It also affected, Tennessee and some of those surrounding states, but my family was living in Kentucky at the time, and it was such a rare occurrence, and it was such a major earthquake for them that it freaked them out. And so they just picked up and moved to get away from what they considered an unstable place. I didn't discover that by reading about my own ancestors. I discovered that by becoming really familiar with some of the other people who lived in that area and who migrated with them to Arkansas, and found that one of them had a little biography written about them in a local history that explained why they left Kentucky. So when you start to think about immigration and migration, understanding who they moved with, whether they were relatives or not, helps you understand maybe why, or helps you find the resources to answer why they may have done that. Pay attention to whether or not they own property. In most of the census records through the 1800s, there is notations about property. You have information about real estate as well as personal property. They're little dollar amount columns. In 1900, those census records start to list whether or not they own or rent their home. Understanding whether or not they own property gives you insight into their financial condition. And if you pay attention through the years, you may see their financial condition improve, or you may see it devolve. And that's important to note. It tells a story, again, about the family. If you've got a family who owns thousands of dollars of property or a home in a nice neighborhood in 1920, and then by the 1930 census you realize they're renting a home in a busy city, that says something about what may have affected their financial condition, especially if you understand about the great stock market crash of 1929. So ways in which the records that you're looking at combined with the history of the time tell a story about what's going on in the lives of your ancestors. Military service is another great way to look for historical context. Did any of your family members, did any of your ancestors or any of their family members serve in the military? So following the Kelly Clarkson episode of Who Do You Think You Are a couple of weeks ago, I actually started looking at one of my third great-grandfathers. I had a notation that he had died in 1863, I believe. And so I assumed that he died in the Civil War based on where he was living, and I understand that I wanted to know more about his military service. Found out that even though he was from Arkansas, he actually was serving for the Union Army. There was a widow's pension file, 29-page document I was able to locate on Fold 3. Now, after doing that, that's great. That tells a story. I wanted to know more. And so I started looking at each of his brothers, his sons, and his nephews to see where they served. I discovered that some of his sons and one of his sons-in-law all served in the same unit as him. But several of his brothers and their children actually served for the Confederacy. Again, that tells a story as you start to recognize that there were members of the same family serving on opposite sides of this conflict. So look for those kinds of things, again, contextually looking at your family, not focusing just on one specific person. And then finally, and like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, so what was the weather like? There are almanacs that you can get your hands on that talk about the weather at the time. If there were any major natural occurrences, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, anything like that, those certainly would have an effect on your ancestors. But even just things like how much snowfall was there this particular winter, and recognizing that they didn't have roads and snowplows like we did now. Did your ancestor have a child in the middle of the winter in a remote location where no doctor could get to her? That is contextual information about the life that they're living. And so those are the kinds of things that you're looking for. So I would like you to think about what kinds of questions you would ask your ancestors if you could sit down with them. Maybe formulate some of those, and then if you're watching this on YouTube, I would encourage you to leave some of those in the comment section on our YouTube channel so that other users can get an idea for some of the kinds of questions historically that you would ask to gain some of that context. Now let me just wrap up by sharing with you some of the additional places you can find the answers. If you've been listening, you hopefully have an idea of some of the places that I've shared where you can find that information. Censuses, pensions, almanacs, but here's just a few more ideas. Of course, you're going to want to extract all possible information from the records themselves. I have sat with people this week who, as we've looked over just a simple census record, and I've explained things like, this says they were married when she was 17, she's the mother of 6 children, only 3 of those children were still living. They didn't understand that that's what those columns meant on the census, and so they had no idea that they were missing pieces of information. So one of the habits that I have gotten into is anytime I find a record, I actually transcribe that record into the notes for the person. I do that in my Family Tree Maker program, and if you've spent any time with me at all, you know how I do this. But in the notes function in Family Tree Maker, I just transcribe what I find in the records as I find them. What that does is it forces me to look at everything, make sure I've got all the information off of that document, but then it also puts it in almost a story view here. So I can skim down here and I can see his real estate in 1850 was valued at $3,000, and that was in Georgia. By 1860, he had moved to Arkansas, and his real estate is now valued at $4,000. He's got an additional $775 worth of property. In 1850, he had 8 children living with him. By 1860, only 2 children are living at home. Here in the middle of that, in 1853, he sold his land to 2 of his brothers, and that's when he moved. Now, that information came because of these 2 census records. I went looking for, when did he move from Georgia to Arkansas? When during that decade? What happened to the property that he owned in Georgia? Because I knew from the census that he owned property. So extracting all the information you can from the records you find helps you know where to go look for additional information and what kind of information you should be looking for. So that's one tip. Another tip, use maps to understand the geography of the time and place. That's really important to do. When you use maps to understand the geography of the time and place, you start to see how people may have migrated. When you recognize, you know what, there's no mountain range there, or there's a river there, or this mountain range may have prevented them from going that direction. You start to understand what things looked like, where the boundaries of counties and states were. That becomes really important. Now, another thing you can do is locate timelines so that you have some kind of a framework to start with for major world, national, and local events. One of the timelines that I've discovered, I actually took and put on the Ancestry.com Pinterest account. So if you go to Pinterest and look up Ancestry.com, you will find all of our pins, and if you just scroll down, you'll find a timeline. I actually found this by Googling American History Timeline, and this is a woman who she homeschools her children, and so she just put together this basic timeline for her family so that she can teach her children. Well, she put that up on her blog, and so here I have pinned it, and if you click it, it takes you through to her blog post. But this is just a really fantastic at a glance. Here's what was going on and some of the prominent figures, every 20 or 30 years or so, from before 1630 all the way through the year 2000. And so it's just a really handy reference sheet to have so that you can start to become familiar with some history. You may notice here also on Pinterest, I have pinned some basic maps. This is a map of the United States from 1800. So this particular map just shows you what the boundaries of the states and the country were at the time, so that you can start to understand, why your ancestor may have said they lived in Indiana, but they ended up in, Michigan, and they never moved. Well, it's because the boundaries may have changed around them. So historical maps of the time. Again, if you just go to Pinterest and search for Ancestry.com, you should find our Pinterest account, and I've tried to pin some things that are helpful, but you can also just do your own Google searches. If your family comes from other countries and you want to look for timelines of major historical events there, Google can be your friend, or any search engine really. Also, and this is something you can find on Ancestry.com, I would encourage you to explore local histories and then newspapers of the time and place. So local histories a lot of times they were written in the mid to late 1800s, sometimes in the early 1900s, where a community was asked to create a history of their town or of their county. Who were the first settlers who came here? Who was the first baby born? When was the first school created? What was life like for those early settlers? Who were some of the prominent people in the community from that earliest time until now? Those local histories are a gold mine. And again, even if your ancestor is not mentioned in them specifically by name, you can start to get a feel for the community that they lived in and the life that they lived, the kind of things in their environment that affected them. Here's where you're going to find those on Ancestry.com. If you come into Ancestry.com and you hover over search, you're going to click on that card catalog. Scroll down here to these filters, and you're looking for one that says stories, memories, and histories. And then you have a few options. The ones that I'm particularly fond of are the social and place histories. Then you can filter further by location. So I could say I want to see those in the US, and maybe I'm specifically interested in a community in Ohio. So I can click on Ohio. It will then show me maybe further by county. So I am now looking at 4 books, social and place histories, 4 books that were published that are histories of this location. You'll notice one here is a history of north central Ohio, and it lists several counties. This one is a history of the pioneer and modern times of this specific county. You'll notice over here on the right hand side I can browse it by chapter. I can look at the table of contents. I can check the end of it and see if there is any kind of an index. If I knew that my family was from a specific town in that county, I could just jump right to the chapter for that location. If you scroll down again past that search box, you can actually see when the original book was printed. In this case, the original book that this is a digital copy of was printed in 1863. So that gives you an idea of the time period that it covers. Of course, it's going to be pre-1863. Now you can search it. I could come in here and just type in a surname of mine that exists in that location, and it'll tell me that there are 9 results, and I could jump directly to that page of the book. And I think that that's maybe a little bit useful. But again, remember, you're trying to understand the historical context of your ancestors. So maybe sit down and read it just like you would any other book. Just, page by page, you can zoom out a little bit and figure out what works for whatever device you're reading. And then down here at the bottom, you have your page arrows, and you can just go page by page through the book just like you would any other book that you're reading, just to get a feel for that location. Again, we have thousands of these on our website, these social and place histories. The best way to find them is to use the filters over here on the left-hand side, where you filter down to stories, memories, and histories, then to social and place histories, and then you can filter further by location. In this case, we've got almost, not quite 18,000 of them just for the United States alone. Those give you a really good feel. Newspapers are also another way, and again, you use the card catalog the same way to find what newspapers Ancestry.com has available. Filter down to newspapers as the record type, then filter by location. Ancestry.com also has a supplementary website called newspapers.com where you can access additional newspaper titles. If you are a current Ancestry.com subscriber, a subscription to newspapers.com is 50% off for you, so certainly something worth looking into. Lots of places you can find information to give your ancestors some historical context. Let me just wrap up. We're running out of time, but I just want to wrap up with some information about how you can record that. Something that I have learned is that all great researchers write. And so get in the habit of writing. Write yourself. You decide how you keep those notes. You can do it in a notebook, which is actually how I started. I just had a little spiral-bound notebook, and every time I sat down to research, I would write myself research notes. As I discovered that there was more sophisticated software available, or as I wanted to write additional information or make notes about more things, I started keeping that information in my Family Tree Maker program. So you can see here I've showed you how I transcribe the records, but sometimes I actually put in narrative information. So this is my 6th great-grandmother, and after doing some research on her, I discovered that she left the Church of England to become Puritan. She joined the Puritan faith. That caused some issues in her community where she lived because she chose the Puritan faith over the Church of England. And then just based on the circumstances of her life, I discovered that that may have required her to do some things that she wouldn't have done otherwise because she was in an unfavorable position in her community. That may have caused her to lose out on some jobs or some other opportunities to support herself and her family, and she ended up stealing some food at some point. I do have a prison record for her from Newgate Prison where she was charged with that felony charge of thievery in 1729. Actually, it was she was sentenced to convicted at Old Bailey, and so then she was sold into indentureship at the age of 18. She was bought. Her indentureship was bought by a man named Tobias Phillips. He was a wealthy landowner in Virginia, set her up on his property, and in spite of the fact that he was married and having children, he ended up fathering 2 children by my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. And all of that was information that I found in records, and I've transcribed a lot of those records here. You can see in the notes, but I just did a little summary here at the top of her notes about her life based on the information that I had found, so that anybody who comes to see this will see the notes that I've made about her life as well as the records that I've discovered. So that's how you can do it for old ancestors. If you want practice on people you know. Maybe open up your Family Tree Maker program or your online tree and open up the notes feature and write a sentence or two about your favorite memory about your grandfather. He was someone you knew his life. It doesn't have to be lengthy. Just write what you know. Record some of those memories of some of the people that you already know about, just to get some practice, but also to record that family history for future generations. Well, today's presentation was a little bit lengthy, but hopefully that was useful. As always, if you have additional questions, you can ask them on our YouTube channel or send them to me at ask@ancestry.com. Particularly if you have suggestions for future broadcasts, please send me an email and I will put that on our list to look at for our schedules for September and October. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.